Hi, everybody. Today is Monday, December 9th, and Colonel Jacques is back with us. Welcome back, Colonel.
Yes, thank you very much for having me back in your show. Thank you.
Let's start with what's going on in the West Asia, the situation in Syria. There was some sort of chaos in Syria. Assad right now is the government has fallen. Assad is in Russia. We had we haven't seen the Syrian army fighting against the rebellions, these HTS fighters, and Iran and Russia seems that they're confused with this situation. Here is the note coming from the Russian government. Their statement, they're talking about what has happened in Syria was decided by the Syrian government. They were not part of the process of deciding what's going to be the next, what's going to be the future of Syria, and how they're going to decide about the future of their country. And Iranian are talking the same way. And but after all, when you look at Syria and the importance of Syria and what has happened in Syria, what's your take on what has happened?
Well, I have studied quite extensively the Syrian conflict in my book, Governing by the Fake News.
Let
And
me show
I
it,
studied,
please.
sorry, yes, I show again, Governing by Fake News. And I studied that quite extensively because obviously this is a conflict that started and well initiated, in fact, from the outside. This has never been a revolution or a rebellion from inside of Syria. This was something that was guided from the outside. And we have seen that very concretely with the arrival of Libyan foreign fighters, those who actually toppled the Gaddafi government in Libya. They came afterwards in Syria, and you had, and if you look at the figures, by the way, it's quite interesting to see. This was uh, uh, I can show that um, the when they the West Point Center for the Study of Terrorism or Research on Terrorism, they studied where the combatant in Afghanistan and Iraq came from, and they found that 85% of them came from the area of Benghazi, Darna, exactly the place where the Libyan revolution started. And then we have when we look at the foreign fighters in 2014 that came into Syria to fight the government, you see incredible numbers of Libyan, Turkish, Tunisian, Lebanese, Iraqi fighters, and so on and so forth. You even had people from Russia, mainly coming from the Dagestan
Chechnya.
area and Chechnya exactly. So, but no, Chechnya is listed here separately. Here there are those from Dagestan and so. So in any case, we see that we had at that time literally a revolution staged from outside, and in I don't want to go into all the details of that war, but we have to understand that when this war started in 2011, Syria was a viable state. You had institutions, functioning and working institutions. You had an army. You had infrastructures. You had and so on and so forth. And they waged a very, very tough war with those insurgents or foreign fighters and so on. And that was a war where the Syrian population suffered a lot. And because of the sanctions, because of the permanent bombing coming from Israel, coming from United States, having part of the country occupied by the Kurds and the US, or Kurds backed by the US, having all resources confiscated or literally stolen by the US. Um, and a part of the country, namely the northern western part of the country, still occupied by those Islamists, because in 2017, based on discussion between Russia, Turkey, and the Syrian government, they created those so-called de-escalation zones that were in the here a map probably of to illustrate my point. There were those de-escalation zones in the area of Idlib, the area of Daraa here in the south. You had a small area in close to Damascus, and other close to Hama. And all the Islamists were regrouped in those areas. And they were there. I mean, this was a presence. But the problem is now you have all these Islamists in some places. You don't have all the resources you had in 2011. And when the Syrian government was informed that there were some possibility that the jihadi or Islamists would resume some kind of invasion of Syria, I think the Syrian government was confronted with a dilemma. Either they would start or wage a new war, but without all the preconditions they had in 2011. That means with seriously and severely degraded conditions. I mean, with an army that has not been uh, 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 rearmed or re-equipped and all that, with no capabilities of reconstructing or rebuilding the infrastructures and all that, meaning that starting a war today against the same enemy that has been resupplied, rearmed, and we know they were rearmed because this was even stated in the Syrian press. You had information that the Syrian forces, I can find you here, here we go. So you had those extremists that were trained by Ukrainian with U.S. Support, with U.S. weapons, and so on and so forth. So you had a degraded resources to fight an enemy that was much important in power. So either you would fight against those people and have a very bloody war again, or you would just abandon the idea of fighting and just surrender to the rebels. And my view is, again, I don't know, I'm not in the mind or in the mind of Bashar al-Assad, but my feeling is that he decided to preserve the life of the population of the Syrians. And he said, okay, this is the situation. We don't have the resources, human, physical, and financial resources to wage a new war. And therefore, it's probably better to say, okay, just do and just do it without uh, 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 um, killing people. And in fact, we know that this was something that the Syrian government discussed. I don't know exactly with whom, whether it was with the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham or with the Turkish I have no idea. But apparently, the Syrian government negotiated that, okay, we will not fight, but at the same time, you spare lives. And in my view, this was not to be inconsistent with the person of Bashar al Assad. we have to remember that he was not supposed to be the successor of his father. In fact, when Hafez al Assad died, after, by the way, having concluded the preconditions for a very good agreement with Israel, he died. And then also in Israel, you had the change of government, and everything that had been discussed with the Syrian was just forgotten. But uh, Hafez al Assad should have been replaced by his elder son, and his son died in a car accident and therefore could not succeed to Hafez al Assad. And the elite of the Alawi elite of Syria asked Bashar al Assad to step in. Bashar al Assad is a medic. He's an ophthalmologist, and he used to work in London, was married there, had a family there, and he had absolutely no political ambitions. But the problem is that in Syria, as you have in many countries, and I have seen that personally when I was posted in different countries, especially African countries, that when you have uh, in a country or in an area, you have a group of tribes or ethnic groups, and you want to establish a rule how to govern the area. The Western mentality is to take the most important one, because we see this is the majority, because it's the biggest tribe, it represents the majority in this area, therefore this is the tribe that must rule the area. But in most countries in the rest of the world, especially in Africa and Middle East, and you had exactly the same thing with Saddam Hussein, for instance, or Gaddafi. They don't take the biggest and the strongest tribe to rule the country. They take the smallest one, the one who is the less influential, the one that is probably less likely to use force to impose its view because it has no force. So the larger tribes agree to be ruled by the smallest one. And Saddam Hussein didn't come from the strongest tribe in Iraq, as Gaddafi didn't come from the strongest tribe in Libya. And the Alawi tribe, if you can call it a tribe, but it's a community if you want. The Alawi community in Syria is definitely not the strongest one. It's in fact one of the smallest one. And the idea is that there's a consensus to give the power to the smaller one, the smallest one, so that it cannot impose its view. And as a matter of fact, even if the political power was in the hand of the smallest community in Syria, namely the Alawi, from which Bashar al-Assad is, the Syrian army at that time, I mean, in 2011, the Syrian army was in majority Sunni army, you know? So if it were a struggle between Sunni and Shia or Alawi, then you would have this army massively joining the rebellion. But it's not the case. The Free Syrian Army that eventually created, it was one of the armored factions that opposed Bashar al-Assad. The Free Syrian Army came out of the Muslim Brotherhood that was exiled in Turkey. And they provided the core of the Free Syrian Army, which today is the Syrian National Army, as opposed to the Syrian Arab Army, which is the official Syrian army. So we have here a situation in which Bashar al-Assad was asked to be in the power because he was the only one that all the other political entities or communities could recognize as the leader. This is something which sounds very strange for Western mind, because we tend to have a different approach to power. And in fact, many commentators, 15 years or so, years ago or so, were saying, well, this is a dictatorship of a minority over a majority. But it's not exactly that. It's the majority that accepted to be ruled by a minority, because this minority could not have the influence and use strengths against the rest of the population. And therefore, this gives, if you read things that way, then you have a totally different understanding of the way power is exerted, or was exerted, in Syria. And that explains why Bashar al-Assad accepted, because he was asked to do so, but he was not in search of power. And in fact, we have seen, and that was already just in 2011, or just before the war in 2011, you could see Bashar al Assad going to work, because he didn't live at that time in a presidential palace or something like that. He used to live in a community with other inhabitants, and used to go to the office with his own car without protection. And there were very interesting reports by the French TV at that time, showing Bashar al-Assad driving his own car, going to work as every single white collar in Damascus. So, and later, because the West sponsored this kind of revolution in Syria for the purpose of dividing Syria, in the idea of creating, or let's say implementing, what I probably explained last time, the Yinon plan, which used to be this Israeli plan to disband Syria and to divide Syria in various communities, a Sunni, Kurdish, and Shiite community. Because Israel has always been scared by its huge neighbors, and this was an idea to divide them and to split them, to balkanize them, in order to have more manageable enemies, if you want. And in addition to that, all these people were antagonizing each other, and therefore it was very much the idea of divide et impera of the Romans, so divide and rule. That's exactly the idea. And for that reason, the West supported this insurrection in not very, I mean, this yes, let's call it insurrection in Syria. But I'm not sure that Bashar al-Assad was this terrible Hitler-like person and dictator that the Western media portrayed. I'm not sure at all. And in fact, I know not a French, a U.S. Military that used to be in Syria just prior to the war in 2011. And he used to say that the life in Syria was fantastic. It was almost like in the West. It was very much like in the other countries of the Mediterranean area. You had a sense of freedom. You had women that could have the same attire as in the West and things like that. So you had a very liberal way of life in Syria. But suddenly everything changed, and it was said that Assad was a dictator, that it was killing its population, and you had all these photograph of Caesar that by this guy called Caesar, and I have a whole chapter in my book on this because this was just a masterwork of deception, just in order to disseminate disinformation about the Syrian regime. So we have a situation where Bashar al-Assad had never tried to impose himself to the population. He was not struggling for power because he never asked for power. He never asked to be there, and therefore, if and when this insurgency came in 2011, he fought very bravely with the Syrian army and also the Hezbollah that helped at one point because Hezbollah tried to create a buffer zone because they thought that the Islamic State would try to enter the the Lebanon, but they fought very bravely. The problem is that regardless of how brave this fight was, and there are different accounts of this, I don't want to go into details, but whatever you understand the war that happened in 2011 and the later years, uh, this was bloody for the Syrian population, and a lot of Syrians paid with their life this insurgency. And I think my feeling is, looking at what I've seen recently in the media, in the alternative media, and all that, my feeling is that Bashar al Assad didn't want to repeat that, especially based on the very poor condition in which the Syrian army was. So a lot of other factors played in that. I mean, the incapacity of having ensuring regular pay of the soldiers, probably because of the ramping poverty. We can assume that corruption developed both in the army and administration. That's probably true, and that probably also altered the ability of the Syrian institutions to function correctly and to defend themselves efficiently in case of a foreign invasion, as we have seen since the 27th of October. So, in order to avoid that, in order to avoid a more catastrophic situation for the Syrian people, my feeling is that Bashar al Assad decided to let it go and said, no, we will not repeat that exercise. That was tragic for the Syrian people. I don't want that to be repeated. I'm just making sure that those who will come will not use violence against the civilians, and then let it go. And now the problem is that for the whole region, we'll have an Islamist country just neighboring Israel. So at the end of the day, probably saved the life of a lot of Syrians, but I'm not sure Netanyahu is the winner in the long run of that. Erdogan might probably be the winner. I don't know. Uh, because at the end of the day, uh, that will that will probably help him to have this a territory to give to the Kurds, and because he doesn't want to have the Kurds on the territory of Turkey, but outside, this is not too much a big deal. So it will probably use that Syrian territory to expel some Kurds and have this Kurdish state created. He will be closer to Israel. And remember that a few weeks ago, Erdogan said he was ready to enter Israel in order to protect the Palestinians. So now he's closer to the Israeli border. So in the short term, you can say it's a success for Netanyahu because he defeated Syria. But on the other hand, Erdogan is closer. You have an Islamist government. Of course, these Islamist people from the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and others, because at the end of the day, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is, in fact, a conglomerate of hundreds different armored groups, Islamist armored group. It's not just one group. We people tend to say that this is the Jabhat al-Nusra, and that's just changed name for the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. This is wrong. In fact, the al-Nusra Front or Jabhat al-Nusra changed its name in 2012, 2013 in order to avoid to be sanctions because the Jabhat al-Nusra was considered as terrorist, so they changed the name. But they changed the name to the Jabhat Fat al-Sham. And then after the Battle of Aleppo, since the Jabhat Fat al-Sham was the strongest armored group in the area of Aleppo, it absorbed all other armored groups under the new name of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And from that point, and that's the end of 2016, beginning in January 2017, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham appeared as a conglomerate of about 40, 50 armored groups, and their retreat into the de-escalation zone of Idlib in the northwest of the country. And there they regrouped with even other groups because this was the most organized, the strongest group. So all other groups joined. And today, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is probably a conglomerate of about probably 100 former armored groups in that. But all were sharing the same ideology. A lot of its combatants are, in fact, veterans of the ISIS, the Islamic State, because in 2015, 2016, as the West was bombing the ISIS, especially never when they attacked the Syrian army, by the way, but always when they were confronting the Kurds. That's very interesting. If we look, I don't have the map here, but you can see that on the website, which is airwars.org. You can see that the Western, I mean, the US, the French, the Belgians, and the Dutch, Australians, I think, and probably the British were bombing the Islamic State, but they bombed it only where they were confronting the Kurds, never when they were in the I have to check if I have the map. It's very telling. Oh, here I have it. I thought I didn't have. Here is the map, and you can see the pattern of the bombing, and that was, of course, in Iraq because that was where you had the Sunni groups in order to push them. They wanted to create, and that's the document that we have seen by the DIA in August 2012. The idea was to create a Salafi principality here in this area. And you see the pattern of fighting. This was all where you had the Kurds fighting, here, the Kurdish area. And that's where the bombing took place. But there were a few places where they bombed when there were some attempts for the some groups to enter Jordan or the Golan Heights, but mostly these were pro-government, pro-Syrian government. But the rest, all the strikes you see, were avoiding the Islamic State, because if you look at the map of the Islamic State, it was mainly here, mainly in this central area. So we see that the West was definitely not fighting ISIS with the idea of fighting ISIS. They were just trying to channel the the fighting of ISIS in some direction. And that's exactly what John Kerry said, by the way, when he said that in 2015 the US and its allies observed the movement of ISIS towards Damascus, and they hoped that ISIS would take over Damascus. And they let the ISIS develop in this area. I mean, Damascus in the southeast of the southwest of the country. So we see that the West played a very perverse role in all this conflict. So that's to say that what we have today in sorry, I was saying that when the West started to bomb ISIS, a lot of combatants of ISIS changed group. It changed the flag, if you want, because since the Americans, I mean the Western forces were bombing exclusively ISIS, they changed and they went to the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, meaning that this HTS is manned partly with people coming from ISIS. So the ideology which dominates in these Islamist group is exactly the same as the one of ISIS. So and that's the reason why this war in 2011 and later was so bloody, because these were ideologically highly motivated fighters who used to sacrifice themselves for the sake of winning, in fact. But they didn't win. But that was at a very, very high price from the Syrian population. So these are the people who are today in power in Syria, meaning that countries like Jordan, who might be sensitive to the presence of jihadi in its vicinity, um, and even Israel might be affected by that. Probably not in the run, but in the mid and long run, this might become a problem for Israel. So, and you don't know, because so far this Hayat Tahrir al-Sham was not very much interested in supporting the Palestinian the Palestinian cause. But we may have a change, especially when you see all the massacres, distractions, and war crimes performed by Israel. This might create an incentive for those Islamists to join the fight against Israel. So we don't know. I don't know. But I think it's a gamble that Israel and its allies, including the US, it's a gamble for them, and I'm not sure this gamble will be in favor of Israel in the long run. I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, but I think this is a problem we have to consider for the future. So that's a little bit my take on that. But so my view is that, and that would explain why you had these. For instance, you had no appearance of Bashar al-Assad. I mean, public appearance when the Islamists started their offensive weeks ago. I mean, almost 2 weeks ago. You had no real communication. You had no press conference. You had no public address of Bashar al-Assad to mobilize the population, to create incentives for fighting against them. You had absolutely nothing. The Syrian government was totally absent from the media in the last 10 days. So that is probably the tip of the iceberg that can be explained by the fact that the Syrian government decided from the very beginning they would not fight again. They would not resume a bloody war with those insurgents. And at the end of the day, if the neighbors of Syria want to have an unpredictable Syria, an extremist Syria, an Islamist Syria, well, that will be their problem. And in fact, he just handled the problem to its neighbors. Now, Jordan, unfortunately, Lebanon, and Turkey will have the problem of having such um, a new Syria. On the other hand, we can see that, and that's interesting, and that was widely commented, by the way, that al-Julani, who is the leader of the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, was interviewed by CNN, and he had a very different appearance from what he used to have in the 15 years ago, where he used to look like an Islamist, really. But today, his appearance works closer to the one of Zelensky. I mean, with a green fatigue and without this headscarf and trying to look more, let's say, acceptable for the West. So this might be the sign that Hayat al-Sham probably changed mentality and ideology. This is probably uh, um, this might be the case. I don't know, but it's interesting to observe this difference in appearance.
Carl, when you look at you've mentioned the situation that Bashar al-Assad was in before leaving the power. We had tremendous sanctions coming from the United States and the Western countries. At the same time, the oil was stolen by the United States for years, and the government had no sources of providing these people and the Syrians with any sort of, I don't know, some sort of better life for them, because the situation was so dire. As you mentioned, the military was so weak, and the question is how the Russian government and Iranian government could manage the situation. And it seems that it came to a moment that they couldn't, if the Syrian army is not willing to fight, if Bashar al Assad is not willing to fight against these people, and why Iran and Russia would go there and would fight if the country is not prepared for that. And Bashar al Assad, as you mentioned, his mindset is totally against any sort of conflict in within Syria. How did you find the role of the United States and the way that they have managed the situation by sanctions and stealing the oil of Syria in order to bring Syria to this moment? And it seems that Turkey was totally prepared and in line with the policy of the United States. At the end of the day, it seems that they have thought that it could benefit them.
Well, the position of Turkey is sometimes difficult to understand, but we have to remember that Turkey is a country which is both European and Asian. It's exactly at the border between two continents. It's at the border between two or three religions. It is a country which has never, I mean, even if Ataturk tried to make of Turkey a modern European state, it's a country that never managed to be completely European. And this is also a country that, because of the and after, by the way, the US intervention in Iraq, that stimulated the Islamism in the whole Islamic world. And in Islamism, we have to understand the word. Islamism is not just Islamic extremism. Islamism means Islamic nationalism. And that's slightly different. It's not necessarily extremism. It is just a sense that you belong to the Islamic nation. And therefore, when the US started to attack Afghanistan without any reason, by the way, and started to attack Iraq without any reason, by the way, then, of course, this created a sense of injustice in the whole world. And that stimulated the sense of belonging to the Islamic nationality, if you want. And that stimulated this kind of Islamic nationalism. And therefore, you had those fighters coming from all over the world and pouring into Afghanistan, into Iraq to help the Iraqis and all that. And all that, so this situation had also an impact on Turkey. And remember that Turkey was opposed and tried to oppose the US as the US wanted to make its invasion of Iraq. I mean, in 2012, in 2002, sorry, 2002, beginning of 2003, Turkey was strongly opposed, and in fact, even denied the use of certain air base, I mean, US air base to the US, because they were totally opposed to this attack, because they understood. I mean, Turkey tried to remain a state where religion was not. I mean, it didn't want to become a religious state, in fact. And Ataturk wanted Turkey to be a modern European state. That means a non-religious state. But the Turkish authorities understood at that time that if the US would attack Iraq, this would stimulate Islamism and change the way the Muslims in Turkey would understand the role of their religion. It would be an Islamic nationalism in Turkey. And that's definitely not what the Turkish authorities wanted at that time. And and all these aspects, we have to understand that today, the fact of the matter is that this nationalism has infected the political life in Turkey. Erdogan has taken advantage of that, but that was not the idea at the beginning. So today, and by the way, another concern of Turkey was also the Kurdish question, because the stated objective of the US in Iraq was to give some kind of autonomy to the Kurds, and therefore create some kind of incentive for the Turkish Kurds to have some kind of autonomy as well. So we have, in fact, the damage that has been caused by the US intervention in Iraq is tremendous and goes far beyond the simple territory of Iraq. It has affected the whole region and everything we have witnessed since then, including terrorism in Europe, including the war in Syria, including, I mean, you name it, all the problems we have seen since about 20 years in the Middle East are the result of this US intervention in Iraq based on disinformation and based on lies. So the US bears this responsibility of destabilizing a whole region and creating multiple wars and generating terrorism. And at the end, because they wanted to get rid of terrorism, the US tried to use some terrorist groups to fight other terrorist groups. And that's why they end up to subsidize and support and arm groups like that they even consider as terrorists, like the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. So we have an extremely perverse situation generated and created by the West, created by the US. By the way, it's interesting that when we say, and a lot of people say the CIA said that did that, and probably at one point the CIA had to step in and to uh, 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 to enter the game. But at the very beginning, in 2002, CIA was opposed to the intervention in Iraq. And that's important to say. And that's the reason why the Ronald Rumsfeld had to build a new intelligence structure from scratch in order to have the proper analysis that confirmed his decision of intervening in Iraq, precisely because the CIA didn't want or opposed the idea of entering Iraq. Later on, obviously, when everything was on track and you had the US in Iraq and all that, the CIA had to step in. I mean, they could not be kind of maverick that refuses to work with the rest. So, but at the beginning, the CIA was opposed to that. So we see that a lot of people understood that the intervention in Iraq, at the end of the day was just an idea of some idiots like the Bush the president, his vice president. The name just went out of my head right now, but um, oh, it just went out of my head. In any
It's
case,
Dick Cheney.
Dick Cheney, exactly, Dick Cheney and Ronald Rumsfeld. All these guys promoted this idea of invasion, and this was just for the sake of satisfying their ego or something like that. But this has absolutely no rationale whatsoever. So we have here the first totally irrational decision that created millions of victims, millions of displaced people, millions of refugees, that eventually altered the whole economy of the region, that created the flow of refugees that went to Europe and elsewhere in the world. I mean, this is the consequences of the decision of invading Iraq. I mean, we haven't finished to measure the consequence of that. And in my view, all the presidents of the United States and all the people who were in power since 2002, in my view, should be subjected to some kind of Nuremberg tribunal because they all uh, contributed deliberately to destabilization and creation of terrorism. In fact, they were the biggest sponsor of terrorism than ever existed on this world. All of them, including Obama, by the way. So we have here a situation that, in my view, is criminal, definitely criminal. And it's interesting because now, when we talk about Netanyahu and all that, The Israelis said, yes, but the US has done the same in Iraq and all that. And they are right, in fact. The problem is one crime doesn't justify another one. So it's not because the US was criminal that you're allowed to be criminal, you know. In any case, it's definitely true that the West misbehaved massively in the Middle East, and that created all the problem we have. At the end of the day, the Brexit is probably the result, the indirect result of the policy of Tony Blair of attacking Iraq or joining the invasion of Iraq, creating all the problems you had in Iraq, in Syria, and all that. So these people are so short-sighted, and we can say it. I mean, because I don't have more polite word, but plain idiots, literally. And the word criminal is, in my view, perfectly adapted to these guys. And I think Tony Blair was there was some ideas of putting him in front of a tribunal. These guys deserve not just a tribunal, but that's another that's another topic. In any case, um, the consequences of the invasion of Iraq has been immense, and not just in the Middle East. Europe suffered a lot too, and a lot of the policies we have today in Europe, including censorship, including the reinforcement of security in any country, in fact, restriction of move, the development, the huge development of security and police forces in Europe, that would normally not be. I could even go further and saying the evolution. If you look at the evolution of rapes in Sweden, for instance. That's a direct consequence of this flow of refugees that the Swedes accepted because, of course, these are brainless people. Uh, they, they just decided to have all these refugees, those poor refugees, and all that. And they have a surge in rapes. I think this is a country that has almost the highest, in some areas of Sweden, have the highest rate of rape and crime, uh, and that's mostly because they have all those people that used to be Islamists in Syria, and they tried to flee out of Syria when the government of Syria won. With quotation mark, won the war, and these guys went into Europe, but they were criminals in Syria. They were still criminals in Sweden, and the Swedes now have an incredible problem with these refugees that they never screened properly, because they were fleeing Bashar al-Assad, and Bashar al-Assad is the Hitler. So these guys were probably good guys, but that was wrong. So we have um, all you have a chain of events from the invasion in 2003 of Iraq. This chain of events led to the situation we have today in Europe and many parts of the world. Now, when you talk about the destabilization, there is something I want to mention, because I think I have mentioned that a couple of times on your channel regarding the situation in Ukraine, and I mentioned this report of the RAND Corporation extending Russia competing from advantageous ground, and you remember this document that I've mentioned several times, that has about 300 pages, and that outlines a concept to destabilize Russia. Now, this document was written in April or March 2019, meaning after the Syrian war, or the first part of the Syrian war, if we can say. But interestingly enough, if you read, and that was already mentioned, by the way, in my book on the Operation Z about the war in Ukraine, and I also listed the various measures that were outlined in this document. And if you read that, you have all these measures. Measure one, provide lethal aid to Ukraine. Well, that's self-explanatory. But then the measure two, increase support to the Syrian rebels. And here we see something that is, in fact, an additional layer to the problem in Syria. Syria had to be destabilized and balkanized, if you want. I explained that already. That's the Yinon plan and so on. But there was an additional layer because in 2015, in order to stop the advance of the Islamic State, Russia intervened in September 2015 in Syria and started to support the Syrian Arab army to fight against the Islamist groups. And since then, the rest of the Western world considered that Syria was a very important strategic ally of Russia, and therefore it was worth fighting or trying to impose a new burden on the shoulders of Russia by increasing the level of violence in Syria. And that's exactly what you have here. That was the idea of stimulating the opposition, not just the opposition, but those insurgents coming from outside in Syria, and thus to destabilize the Russian presence and probably to impose to Russia the presence or more substantive presence in Syria by involving other types, additional troops in in Syria, and that would obviously play a role in the war in Syria, and that's probably not uh, foreign of the idea of that you had, and that was mentioned in the Kiev Post, that Ukrainian special forces and Syrian rebels were attacking Russians recently. That was in June this year to export the Ukrainian conflict in Syria in order to impose a new theater of war to the Russians. You had even those Ukrainian special forces from the HUR, which is the military intelligence, the Ukrainian military intelligence, to attack the Russians in Syria. And this was the idea, in fact, from Ukraine to open a new front, a little bit with the same idea of opening a front in the Kursk area or region, in order to, in fact, I would say, overload the threat against the Russians. So we have here a second layer of problems that where Syria became, in fact, the a second reason for using or misusing Syria and trying to destabilize Syria. So there were different factors that contributed to make Syria the target of a destabilization. And with this overwhelming threat, I would say, I think Bashar al-Assad probably rightly considered that it was not worth to fight with the meager resources he had, try to fight and open a new war that would be totally an additional disaster for Syria. So that's why I tend to understand the rationale for Bashar al-Assad. And from the Russian and Iranian side, Remember, in when you had this, that was early this year, when you had this confrontation between Armenia and Azerbaijan, or that was probably last year, I don't remember. And the Armenian decided to hand over the Nagorno-Karabakh to Azerbaijan. And there were, and you still see, by the way, in the comments in on social networks, that Russia abandoned Armenia. But in fact, the rationale of the Russians is that if a country doesn't want to defend a territory, why should the Russians take this task over? You know, um, so this is exactly what happened in Syria when the Syrian government decided not to fight for a reasonable reason. By the way, I think it's a rationale. We can agree or not, but it is a valid reasoning of saying I don't want to sacrifice my population, therefore I will not fight. So why then would other countries fight instead of the Syrians? And that's exactly what happened. Probably that was the same calculation that was made by the Armenians in Azerbaijan with the Nagorno Karabakh, and that's probably exactly what happened here again. So why should you use resources to fight instead of others who don't fight? This doesn't make really sense. It's probably more it's smarter to keep your resources and have in your priorities, and obviously the priority for Russia is the Ukraine conflict, and to keep your resources for your main priority. So I can understand that, and I don't see that as a treason, by the way. I think it's not a treason. It's not a treason if we understand the rationale of Bashar al-Assad. I think it's not a treason from that point of view. We can have different perspective on that. I understand that, but from the point of view of Bashar al-Assad, it was not a treason. And if we accept that point of view, then the behavior of both Iran and Russia were not treason either. But of course, both might be disappointed because obviously, for both countries, both Iran and Russia, losing Syria is losing a very important asset in this region because Syria was definitely an important part of this, I would say, Shiite bridge between Iran and Lebanon, and that's definitely true. I mean, a bridge in the cultural sense, but also in the
We call it
logistical
Shia
sense.
Crescent.
Yes, the exactly this Shia croissant is was important also for the logistic of Hezbollah, for instance. So Syria was not insignificant and had this importance. Therefore, losing this asset is for both Iran and Russia an important loss. And at the same time, since they decided to abandon these resources, this resource or this country, following the Bashar al-Assad perspective, then of course it's a decision. Again, we can judge, the history will judge, but I think there is a rationale for that. We can agree or not, but there is a rationale. There is a rationale which can be understood with some ethics, and that's probably how Bashar al-Assad understood that. Uh, and I can follow that idea. I'm not sure I would do have done the same. I don't know. I'm not. I've never been president of a state, especially of a state. Period. um, and it's always easy to talk when you are not in charge. So it's always easier said than done. But I can I can follow and understand the idea of Bashar al-Assad. And if we understand it honestly, we can probably assume that this was not bad intentioned. Let's put it that way.
Colonel, when you look at Syria and you compare it with what has happened in Libya, in my opinion, Bashar al Assad had two choices: stay in Syria and fighting people and killing people, or going to Russia or somewhere else. And he has decided not to kill Syrians, not to have any sort of big fight in Syria, which is, I think, it's very important for the future of Syria. And we know what has happened in Libya. We know those people who were fighting Gaddafi right now, they're looking for someone like Gaddafi. That may come to Syria and the situation that we're witnessing right now. These people who are in power right now in Syria, these rebels, were fighting each other in Idlib. They can, the future, that's why I think that the future maybe is not in the hand of these people. Maybe there is a future for Bashar Assad in Syria. But when you look at the situation, putting this aside, when you look at the situation, do you find Iran and Russia weaker than before against the United States and the hegemony that the United States wants in the region?
Well, there are different ways of understanding that. First of all, when you say that those groups are fighting each other in Idlib, it's partly true in the sense that mostly what you had, and not just in Idlib, by the way, because you had those inter-faction fighting already before being in this de-escalation zone in Idlib. The problem is that those people were not really fighting because they didn't agree with each other, but they were rather competing against each other, you know. And that's why they were competing from some kind of power. So it's exactly like a race, and you try to be the first one to reach the objective. And that was a little bit how these we have to understand those fightings. It's not because you have one guy that thinks white and the other guy thinks black, and they fight because they don't think the same thing. It's not exactly that. They used to have very similar thinking, similar approach to things, similar understanding of religion, the role of religion and Islamism, nationalism, and all that. But they wanted to be the first one. So it's a more competition, an aggressive competition, rather than a fight of an ideological fight, you see. So we have to understand that, because that means that once you have one of those groups, and namely the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, who emerged as leader, then you may have some others that may want to challenge the leader. But in essence, all those who have all the similar ideology will follow that. The, 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 the leader has emerged from the struggle, and that's where we stand today. So we have to be very careful because there was those ideas that those groups were adverse, and that's what, by the way, the rationale of not helping ISIS and saying we help the Jabhat al-Nusra because they are more moderate than ISIS. No, they were not more moderate. I mean, they were all the same, virtually all the same. The only difference is that ISIS managed to build up a kind of state with an organization, with institutions, and things like that. That was a very short lived state, but they managed to do it. That's the only difference. But for the rest, mentality, the way of fighting and all that, that was all the same. Ideology was very similar. There was barely a difference between, I mean, of course, if you read what the ISIS used to write at that time, they explain some ideological or religious difference between, and that was expressed in the different use of words to define enemy. And the Arabic language is rich in different words to define the same thing, but giving different nuances to define a guy or another one, and therefore you can play with that. But in essence, we were a movement that were very, very similar, had very similar ideology. And they were, as I said, they were more competing against each other rather than fighting against each other. So that's the first aspect we have to keep in mind. Now, I don't remember the second part of your question, by the way, because I talked too much.
The second part was the position of Iran and Russia
Oh, yes,
in the
yes, whether it
aftermath.
was weakened. Well, oh, to a certain extent, yes. In the sense, I mean, probably more for Iran. Russia, not really, because I'm not sure that Russia had any ambitions in Syria. Of course, they have those two bases, and as the communique of the foreign ministry says, by the way, if you have that, I think they are the two bottom lines of the communique you showed at the beginning of our program today. The last lines were that they were not, the two bases were not in danger so far. So far, I can assume that there were some that was probably part of the deal. I don't know. I have absolutely no idea. And it might be that the Russians may have to leave those bases. But by and large, you know, the idea of having access to Mediterranean was a key during the Cold War for the Soviets, because first of all, confrontation between the two blocs was considered as a real danger. And therefore, having a presence in the Mediterranean, not being closed or enclosed into the Black Sea, was vital for the Soviet Navy. And therefore, they had not only Syria, but you had very frequently the Soviet fleet in Libya and in Algeria, for instance, very often, because they managed to have all these allies and to keep a standing presence in the Mediterranean. Because it was vital in case of a conflict in Central Europe to have this ability to to avoid being attacked from the south, from the Turkish side. And Turkey was part of NATO, by the way. So, and Turkey has the command of the Dardanelles Strait and could close the access to the Black Sea. So it was a vital need to have those bases in in Mediterranean. Today, the problem is slightly different because Russia, as opposed to what we hear in our media, has no interest. I mean, there was no. We have to understand that during the Cold War, our understanding, the Western understanding of Soviet aggressiveness, was that we assumed that the Soviet Union would like to propagate its communist ideology. That was the driver of their aggressivity. Assuming that, today we don't have this anymore. There is no reason for Russia to attack from any kind of reason, and even this idea of propagating communism or Marxism, this is something that was probably true under Stalin, but probably no longer in the 70s and 80s, but in any case, that's how we perceived it. But today you have nothing similar. I mean, Russia is definitely, from its structure, economic structure, society, the way it works globally, not globally in the world, but generally, I would say. Um, it is a it works again as a west in a Western pattern, if you want. It's a West. The pattern of the Russian society is very much Western, with the same kind of idea, and probably they are a little bit more conservative than we are in the Western Europe. But in by and large, it's the same ideology in the economic ideology. I mean, it's a industrial based free market and all that. So it's not the kind of a planned economy that we had in the during the Cold War. Therefore, what would be the reason for Russia to attack Western Europe? We don't see that anymore, and I think Russians have absolutely no intent of doing that. The the reason why they entered Ukraine was not because there was an appetite of territory, but because the Russian minorities in Ukraine were threatened. That's the reason of the military intervention. Using the success on the ground in Ukraine, they will achieve a political success, or they want to achieve a political success in preventing NATO to get closer to the Russian border. But this is a byproduct of the intervention in Ukraine. So that's very important to understand. So the Russians don't have ambitions to occupy the rest of the world. The US, and it's interesting, by the way, if you look the US forces, I think it's the only forces in the world that are organized based on a world, geographical zones. I mean, you have a Pacific Command, you have a Central Command, a Southern Command, Atlantic European Command, African Command, and all that. This is the only forces in the world that has a command for specific areas of the world. The Russians don't have that. The Chinese neither, because these countries do not have a need to have an African command. They don't plan to operate in Africa. The US does, and that's the reason why they have a European command, Africom, and so on, or Africacom. So, in any case, this this difference, I mean, this approach of having a defense arranged for the defense of their own territory, and I would say the success they have today by keeping and probably keeping the whole of the Black Sea under their control makes the need for the bases in Syria probably less important than they used to be in the Cold War. And therefore, yes, it probably be a loss, especially if they have to abandon those bases. But Syria as such is not necessarily an asset that Russia wanted to keep. For Iran, it's slightly different, because for Iran, that was the kind of lifeline for the Hezbollah. And that was, they had also very strong ties with Syria, also because of the religious background and cultural background. So it's probably the loss would be more important for Iran than it is for Russia, I would assess. But again, probably some others have other views. I mean, again, everything, if you look at from the Russian perspective, everything relates to how they can use the Syrian territory, But again, during the Cold War, for instance, you had a very strong Soviet presence in Syria. They were training the Syrian army. You had these air defense. The most modern equipment was provided to Syria the, at that time. Today, it's very different because during decades, Russia had not the resources to support Russia in the same way they did during the Cold War. As a result, you have some distance that has been created between Syria and Russia. Therefore, I don't see it's certainly a loss for Russia, but I don't see that as a dramatic loss for Russia. As I said, it's probably more important for Iran.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Colonel, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
That was my pleasure. Thank you very much. Bye bye.